Alice emotions as a moral force rather than rejected, there creates space for emotions within moral philosophy. It rejects the view of dominant moral theories that relationships and attachment cannot be the basis for legitimate moral decisions and prioritize decisions based on care when making those moral decisions. Team to the finals, we can take a picture. The 4 teams, are you good? Yeah? Can we move on? OGO, CGCO? 1 second. Runners to the teams, please give them water.
Firstly, I'd like to congratulate all the teams for making it to the finals. Please give them a round of applause. Alright, without further ado, on the motion this House as the feminist movement will actively endorse the ethics of care, I invite the Prime Minister. Hello, check, check. Finally, it is sad that as a feminist movement, it is always first to question people on their privilege. As a feminist movement that has been trying so far to protect the rights of abused women, we are fundamentally ignoring their needs, their choices, and their ideals in societies. We think it is detestable that the fact that we assume that this is the right choice for an abused woman to make and blame them as a feminist movement ourselves when they fail to do so. So what do we mean by endorsing the ethics of care? It is a fundamental change in our perception of abused women and what choices that they have to make. That is to say that when women are abused in relationships, like for example domestic abuse and marital rape, it is acknowledging that a choice to stay in that relationship is fundamentally illegitimate and that no one is better placed to make the choice than the victim themselves. That is to say that when there is a woman that has been abused repetitively, we have to change our perception of what choices they should have, rather than just taking them away from that family to allowing them to approach things like anger management classes or relationship counseling, and that's the radical change that we necessitate on our syllabus. 2 arguments from side proposition B and speech. First, it is morally illegitimate and bankrupt to invalidate a victim's calculus on the basis of emotion. And second, we are a fundamentally better feminist movement for the abused. First, it is morally illegitimate to invalidate the victim's calculus for emotion. Firstly, why is the ethics of care in general and in specific legitimate? First, because no one views what is just best for them in a vacuum. That is to say that to emote is to be human, and therefore it is illegitimate to look at humans as robots who make pros and cons lists and tick the right ones, rather than looking at them as individuals capable of making choices on the way they feel towards other people. But second, even if the way we look at this choice is to look at what is best for these women, we don't understand why, if that emotion enriches them, it is not still best for them to still stay in that relationship. What we therefore think is that we should allow these women to make decisions based on the ethics of care, that is based on what they want to be. That is, they could want to be in that family, they could want to be a mother, and they could want to be a wife, and that is what we necessitate. But second, we think it is particularly hypocritical for us to not allow this choice. Why? Because social conditioning fundamentally creates a situation where women are expected to love or care. That is to say that women are grown, asking them to care for their kids, care for their families, especially in conservative societies that are built out of bikini and cap, which by the way are also the societies where a large part of this debate is happening, because a large part of domestic abuse happens here. Therefore, we think it is first illegitimate to neglect the fact that the social conditioning has happened and hypocritical, but second, also victim blaming for us to expect these women to leave because it is their fault for not leaving an abusive relationship. At the point at which any woman who leaves a relationship on the basis of abuse that is normalized in these societies is seen as a traitor to their family and to their society. At the point at which they are seen as a failure in protecting their children, it is a hypocritical creation of a choice on their behalf that we will not tolerate. But thirdly, we think it creates a double jeopardy for this woman at the point at which we make this choice for them. How is this so? Specifically, we think in the context of battered women, when women are punished, when their children are abused for staying in that relationship, we think it's fundamentally illegitimate for all the reasons that I've already told you. But second, at the point at which we not just blame the victim, but also actively go ahead and punish them, we think and make them lose what they like. That is the love to their family, the interest to grow, to create a good child or a great citizen. But also, we make them lose access to their, not only punish them, not only blame them, but also make them lose access to their family and to their respect in society. We think it is illegitimate. Note that if we win this argument, if this stance, we automatically, absolutely win this debate, because we've shown you that it is a moral imperative that these abused women absolutely deserve. But moving on, right? The second argument that we have for you is that we get a better feminist movement for the abuse. One, the feminist movement, when it comes to abuse, needs to support women. Firstly, therefore, it is arbitrary for you to make choices on behalf of the women. But second, it is almost always imposed by your privilege that you think that the right choice to make is to leave this relationship. At the point at which you are distinctly and disconnected from that situation, you are in no way capable of making the choice for that woman. But second, we think it is illegitimate that the choice for these abused women who have already faced the trauma of abuse, I'll take you in a moment, is choosing between their family and their society and living in a world without abuse. That is an illegitimate calculus that we will not impose on these women on our citizens. But third, by changing the outlook at which we look at these, that is by allowing them to approach relationship counseling or anger management, for example, we enable them to make a legitimate choice and emancipate them from the barriers of the legal system. I take over.
So please characterize for the first time in the debate how the core demographic that currently supports the feminist movement will react to your move.
The point here is we don't care. Who we care about is the abused women, and therefore we have two positive impacts to talk to you about at the end of this argument. First, we think by changing the outlook, we are necessarily, rather than traumatizing a woman who has already been abused and looked down by society and family, giving them access to a fallback mechanism, to a system that protects them. But secondly and most importantly, we are the only ones in this debate who are creating a surge in reporting. That is to say that women who have so far been shielded by the problems of society, who have so far been, as a result of the trauma of separation from their family, been secluding their own abuse and living with it, are now no longer subject to the harmful dichotomy of living in their family with their children and having a world without abuse. Therefore, we are the ones who bring thousands of women out of their homes to the NGOs, to the police department, by creating a situation where we fight for their rights, fight for their ability to stay in that relationship, garner all the emotional attention they need and be able to give their love, while at the same time being emancipated from abuse. Look at it. So here's how we have to look at this debate at the end of the day. The rights of the women we are trying to protect are the rights of the abuse. Irrespective of what they want to talk to you about whether white feminists are going to get educated or whether upper caste women who will never be subject to abuse are going to get educated, we don't care. Who we actually care about are the women who are trapped in false dichotomies, who we emancipate to release themselves out of abuse and bring them out to report it. We are absolutely proud to propose this motion.
Ms. House thanks the Prime Minister and invite the Leader of Opposition.
The idea of the feminist movement is that it seeks to destroy constructs that have shackled women for generations to positions where they're made to feel inferior, right? We think reinforcing these ideas by instituting and actively endorsing the standard of care makes it harder for us to correct the biases and conditioning that already exists in society. We think it's incredibly callous for opening government to concede that a lot of these issues are because of the conditioning, but providing no counter in terms of how we essentially seek to destroy these constructs to begin with, right? We think this debate needs to be assessed from a framework of how best to deal with the same set of people that they are talking about. Because at no point on opening opposition are we going to contest that it is all, like right off the top, absolutely illegitimate for a woman to stay in an abusive relationship. The harm is, at the point at which you actively endorse your standard of ethics of care, it obfuscates the ability for us to have discussion to show why staying in these relationships or why promoting this culture of subservience in itself is particularly problematic, right? And that will be the line that we will argue from opening opposition through three constructives. First of all, why the idea, sit down, why the idea of the standard of care, like the ethics of care, is derivative of the same kind of gender roles that we wish to abolish, right? Secondly, why we alter the decision-making calculus from being one of independence to that of interdependence, why this is problematic. And thirdly, why we think the idea of correcting social conditioning and biases is one that seeps across generations and is something that's particularly problematic, right? Now on to a couple of clarifications in terms of what we heard from the previous speaker, right? Now they've identified this debate largely to be within the domains of things like domestic violence, like abusive marriages, and things like marital rape. We tell you, at the point at which you actively endorse the ethics of care to suggest that it is legitimate for you to say this solely on the basis of interdependence, solely on the basis of emotions, we think it legitimizes this to the extent where it obfuscates and takes away from the actual discussion to be had in terms of why sometimes the idea of you staying in that relationship is more harmful for you at all, right? We think this largely jades their perception to a significant extent. But secondly, and this is something that they have to deal with, right? The women who choose to stay in these sort of abusive relationships aren't really actors who care about the feminist movement to begin with, right? Which means they're devoid of the sort of they've already passed the threshold to stay devoid of the sort of criticism that the feminist movement could possibly direct at them. So we don't understand under their paradigm, at best, if they seek to reach out to these women, what is the value that they are adding over here, right? But secondly, in terms of what they told us, right, that no one makes their decisions solely on the basis of vacuum, and that things like emotions and feelings often play into your idea. We agree with that, right? But the idea is, are these emotions and feelings largely devoid of the sort of social constructs that promote this sort of idea to begin with, right? Because we think the dominant social narrative that currently still continues to exist is that women should necessarily stay with men to begin with, right? That they do have to stay in marriages because it is their sole duty to provide for the man, right? What opening government wants to do is to say that this decision made in an atmosphere where this is the most dominant narrative is something that we want to legitimize over here. We think the underlying premise and principle needs to be a manner for us to take away and destroy these underlying principles that are inherently skewed against them anyway, right? Because we don't really think that under our paradigm, we're going to be shaming women themselves for choosing to make these decisions. Rather, we want to tackle the idea of the narratives that continue to plague society. But we think what they're doing on their paradigm is feeding into the sort of conditioning that already exists. But thirdly, we'll also argue to you like why we don't really think we're punishing them twice in this scenario, but more why the idea that this conditioning seeks across generations is something that's problematic. But onto the first idea, right? We think what actively like endorsing the ethics of care in itself feeds into traditional gender roles that we have to beat out of, right? Because the idea is that things like emotions and feelings are often seen as something that women tend to opt into more, right? That often the decision-making calculus that women often choose is one of emotions and feelings, right? And we think this largely has skewed the perception of women in status quo. We think what their move does in terms of using this as the primary means of tackling all of our issues feeds into the same rhetoric that we need to account for this inherent disparity between men and women, right? To suggest that because sometimes they do feel things differently, or sometimes they do value their emotions more than like men, we have to account this and introduce that in our line of strategy, right? We think that's particularly problematic. But secondly, we think the reason in terms of why this necessarily weakens our ability to actually effectuate change is that the idea of emotions and emotions and feelings aren't really things that like large society can like grapple with or seen as something that's tangible, which means as the feminist movement, the ability for us to speak to people in a language that they understand needs to be along the lines of things where we show statistics of the harms that accrue to women at the point at which they say in things like this. We think speaking to them in a language that is vague, that is intangible, and sometimes simply cannot be defined makes it far harder for us to push for a lot of to push for the sort of change we want to effectuate. Before I move on, closing.
Okay, what does an ethical system that does not have the ethics of care incorporated in it look like? And why is this superior to one that...
Look, we think currently the standards that we employ in terms of showing things like statistics and actively engaging in discussions with women to show what the particular harms of the kind of conditioning looks like is something that we favor on our side. But let's take a look at what their side necessarily promotes, right? We think currently the decision-making calculus that would be fostered under their side is to necessarily prioritize the idea of interdependence, right? And what this does is, particularly in relationships, is that it promotes the idea that the decisions you need to make need to be viewed through the lens of what the husband wants in itself, right? And the problem with this, Madam Speaker, is that it promotes the same sort of culture of subservience to the man in the relationship that we want to move out of, right? Because we need to understand that often these girls and women that we're talking about were brought up in a context where they were often told that they are emotional, right? Or that they should play up their emotion and act as a counter to the necessarily masculine man or husband in the relationship. But that feeds into the rhetoric again that men necessarily have to factor into the decision at every point of time, right? That your values and your feelings and things like that in terms of how this could possibly affect your husband or how it could possibly affect your boyfriend necessarily needs to factor into your decision-making calculus. We think this culture of interdependence is severely more toxic for these women over here. But the underlying idea is, at the point at which we promote this idea of ethics of care, we further strengthen the same sort of conditioning and are never really breaking out of it, right? Because we think the idea of questioning continuously needs to happen. The reason why that doesn't happen on their side is because you understand that to a large extent, these things are legitimate, right? That it takes away from a large portion to suggest that sometimes it is justifiable for you to act out in this particular way, which means that the conditioning and the sort of adaptive preferences that women opt into over the generations becomes far harder for us to critique and far harder for us to actually check under their paradigm, right? We think for us to be able to break out of the shackles that have continued to withdraw women, it's important to break the constructs that continue to feed into this culture of subservience and gender roles. Incredibly proud to oppose.
You tell the leader of opposition in this house invites the Deputy Prime Minister.
Madam Speaker's side opening seems to be as ignorant of the issues that battered women brought up in a patriarchal and conservative setup face, the current issues that they set up that they face, and this is the exact narrative that the privileged women dominating these feminist movements employ to collectively shut out the voice and portray these women to be weak and not relevant to the issues till the time they buy into the narrative of these privileged women that you need to have that power, you need to be empowered, and only then you will be recognized as a true feminist. To the extent that this is the kind of narrative you're selling, in which you essentially have have to buy into an ideology that is dominated by that section, that creamy layer of women who are the most empowered in the section of the society, who are the ones who have had all the privileges since the time they were born. We don't understand how this issue will become relatable to the women who are actually battered by harassment, marital abuse, and like domestic marital rape and domestic abuse. 4 points of rebuttal. How will the feminists react was the POI they asked. We don't care, right? If the feminist movement systematically excludes a section of the society of battered women and millions of women suffer from this abuse, then we think that there is something fundamentally wrong with the feminist ideology and there needs to be a reformation in that ideology. To the extent you do not change this and continue to put the onus on the women who have suffered this harassment and abuse, we think that's an unfair metric you are applying to these women, especially when they have been brought up in a conservative society. It's too extreme and at best it's irrational. Secondly, ability to have discussion under our paradigms apparently is limited. We don't understand how because they gave us no reason. So theirs is the status quo, right? Which is something that Arjun conceded to. That under the status quo, we currently, like the feminist movement has been going on for so long, still we have such limited participation of the battered women. Means that there is something wrong with the status quo which we continue to adhere to. Which means that their change in status quo is required. What kind of change is required? You have to include the women who suffer from these abuses. How do you include these women actually? When you concede to the fact that the kind of like the distinct nature of your suffering is something that we account for, like the ethics of care. So within the emotional capacity that you have, we think that the decisions like you make should be more rational and more responsive, not independent of your emotional capacity. Because understand that in our society, there is no net benefit seen to moving away from emotions. So we are essentially emotional beings and we are brought up in a society where emotions are legitimized. We don't see why in specific cases of battered women, this parameter of employing emotions in your decision-making metric should be necessarily neglected and like used to exclude a section of section of women who need their voices to be heard. But moreover, they don't participate in this movement. Obviously, because you adopt a condescending attitude towards them and you say that if your child gets killed because your abusive husband was abusing you, but even in that case, you should have prioritized your motherhood over, like you should have prioritized your motherhood, not accounting for the kind of mental trauma that you underwent. And for this, you are sentenced to 40 years of prison in the American judicial system. This is problematic essentially because if this is the standard you apply, like if all the social stigma of patriarchy continue to plague you in the scenario, in the current paradigm of the feminist discussion, we don't see why women would warrant this risk to participate in the feminist movement because it will gain visibility to the social stigma. So understand that the society hasn't changed. The social stigma of walking out of marriage or not prioritizing your children will still be attached to you, right? But the social structures to support you after that do not exist currently, and this is something that we seek to resolve by like including the emotional aspects of it, which will increase the number of cases you report, like by seeking anger management counseling, but more on that later as to like we'll deal with specific cases of countries like India where it's like men are as well as stakeholder and just because they are a bit abusive, towards their wives does not mean that the wives necessarily walk out in it, and this is the kind of tribunal that you're talking about before that go quickly.
Is the wife's decision to jump into her husband's funeral pyre something that's legitimate under your paradigm?
No, Madam Speaker, we still think that if someone is dying, that is essentially problematic, right? But what we say is that if the choice, so currently this is not a choice that women are making, or this is the kind of, this is not the sort of arbitrary discussion we want to have of the 19th century India, but under the current feminist paradigm in which the kind of abuses that they suffer from is more subliminal, there is no visibility to the kind of abuses that they suffer from. So we wish to gain visibility for these abuses by legitimizing their voices, that is by not adopting a condescending attitude, but by conceding that the kind of environment that you were brought up in was oppressive, and you acted to the best of your capacity within the privileges, within the limited privileges that were granted to you. So it's not mutually exclusive for the feminist movement to campaign against gender roles. You can do that. You can continue to pander to that section of the feminists who say that you are not being fair, who say that you have to be aggressive. But under our paradigm, the discourse on including the battered women can happen equally well, right? This is the kind of discourse that we need to have, and this does not happen to the exclusion of the empowered women or the privileged women, because we are pretty sure that they understand this, and if they don't, there is a need for them to understand this. But more so, Exclusively in the case of realism in countries like India, what happens is that both men and women are brought up in a particular kind of setup of social conditioning, right? Where if you talk to your wife once in a high pitch, or if you slap her once, it's not necessarily seen as extremely wrong, both from the side of the man and both from the side of the woman. The reason why these cases do not get reported is this widespread jingoism of feminists that if you're even if your husband raises his hand on you even once, you need to walk out of that marriage. Which is the reason that these cases do not get reported, and which is the reason that there is a lot of stigma attached to counseling, to like anger management classes, which can actually resolve these issues in a more comprehensive manner and gain some traction for these women. But can also gain traction for the battered women who continue to like prioritize their individuality, like both individuality and motherhood. So essentially on our side of the house, we are not creating a binary between your ability to assert your individuality and your duties as a mother or as a wife. Both can exist simultaneously, which is the kind of binary that they are creating, that either you are a strong, independent woman or who has the capacity to walk out on a marriage, or if you choose to stay in that marriage, it's essentially your fault, and it's your fault if your children inherit the damage of the decisions that you are making. So what you essentially do is what Hemant talked to you about is a double jeopardy, under which scenario the onus always falls on the woman, and there is very little incentive to change the existing structure, right? Because it's often the woman's responsibility to come out and report these crimes, but very little incentive to actually create an environment in which these women can actually be included in the discussion. We have told you why this will cause more reporting of crimes and include the battered women. We have also told you that how on an average it's not mutually exclusive to campaign against gender roles while including these women, and for all these reasons we are extremely proud to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Deputy Leader of Opposition, please.
Madam Speaker, the entire case that's come out from side opening government, right, is premised on the idea that the feminist movement is somehow completely condescending towards the women who are stuck in these abusive relationships, right? We tell you that the battered women, the women who are suffering from the battered women syndrome, are also already a part of the feminist movement in a way, right? Because the underlying principle that supports feminism is that of equality and freedom of choice. We tell you that the moment at which you choose to be in an abusive relationship, for whatever reason, right, the choice you make is still your own, according to feminism. But what we are able to do under our paradigm exclusively is call out the societal conditioning that leads to your choice being made, right? Which means under their paradigm, what is happening is abuse is being offset by the idea that your relationship is equally important, right? We tell you that feminism cannot allow this we cannot allow this legitimization to happen at the point at which we tell you there are such great harms to women in these relationships, right? But also let's understand how the idea of anger management classes is completely preposterous, right? Because we tell you the point at which you are going to have the strength to, let's understand first that the threshold to which the threshold against the women breaking out of these relationships is already extremely high in society, which means society already derides your decision to break out of these relationships. We tell you the only support structure that exists that legitimizes your choice to choose yourself over your relationship is the feminist movement. At the point at which we dilute our own principle and include the same societal constructs that force these women into these relationships, we tell you that's when we are diluting the feminist principle as a whole, right? Let's see where you are able to opt out of these relationships, right? We tell you, one, we are reducing the threshold for your opt out in the first place, independent of any societal structure, because the feminist movement supports your decision. But also, secondly, we tell you everybody, the society around you, right? We tell you women who are capable, who have already broken out of these relationships, often give you advice on how to go about these things, right? We tell you anger management classes aren't the places where these women find the strength to be able to break out of these decisions. These decisions are taken in a place where these women realize that the feminist movement is really fighting for the change, and that's when these people are released, right? But also, let's talk about where the concession that they made when we asked them the POI, right? Their idea is that death is much worse than the meaningless lives that these women lead currently under status quo, right? We tell you, if 100 years ago this debate was happening and feminism existed as it does today, the same principle would have applied to the idea of sati. We tell you it is just as bad that women are forced or shackled in their families for the sake of their children, right? In fact, we tell you these children are also adversely affected by the fact that their mothers choose to remain in these abusive relationships, right? We tell you the only point at which these children, and this is the intergenerational idea that came out from Arjun's speech, right? The only point at which these children are then able to break away from the idea of relationships being the most important thing in your life, right? And we tell you these relationships are inherently skewed towards the power imbalance that exists between men and women. We tell you what happens then as the women, the mothers are able to justify to their child, look, I don't have an option, right? We tell you that is the justification most mothers give to their daughters. But what happens is you will be free of the kind of societal conditioning that has shackled me, right? This is how the intergenerational change happens, to the point where the next generation is more willing to fight for their rights, where they're more brave about their own personal ambition, right? We tell you the next generation is more likely to be ambitious, right? Where they're ready to offset a trade-off the idea of starting a family or having a kid versus being a family person, right? And we tell you that only happens under our paradigm. We don't think we can do both, right? We don't think we can at this fight for equality and logical moral weight, while at the same time conceding that it's okay for your relationships to be just as important. Because what are we doing when we are accepting or endorsing the ethics of care, right? We tell you what happens is you add moral weight to societal conditioning. We tell you societal conditioning in itself is bad enough that people aren't able to live lives as they would, right? What becomes worse under their paradigm is, under our paradigm there is no moral weight, there is no moral justification for a woman to remain in this relationship. We think under status quo, a lot of us are understanding of the decisions that women who aren't able to become a part of the feminist movement make. But we tell you that we want to change the decisions that others make, right? We want to reduce the threshold that exists for women to be able to break out of this societal conditioning, and that happens only at the point at which we do not dilute our standards and get clear on what the principle is that underlies the feminist movement, right? Yes, go ahead.
Do you think that maximizing economic indicators like GDP does anything to ensure that women have more control within their households and in their families?
Like GDP, right? Okay. I think what he's trying to argue is that within your houses where women are often controlling things like finance, that makes them more powerful in themselves, right? So they want to co-opt the societal structures that are oppressing women and say that these are the things that will lead us to liberation, right? We tell you no, feminism has always been seen as a radical movement from the start, right? Which means you are out to fight the societal structures that exist as is. We tell you when we become accepting of certain societal conditions, we are necessarily diluting that same principle. We tell you ethics of care is built on the same, suffers from the same biases that society does itself, right? And we tell you it's even worse because men under status quo are seen as less emotional than women, which means the principle of ethics of care applies disproportionately to women who want to break out of these conditions, right? We tell you there is enough society already legitimizes their decision as it is. These women don't need feminism in the first place to legitimize their decision. But even if they do, right, we tell you feminism, the underlying principle of feminism has always been that of equality, right? Has been that of freedom of choice. We don't think feminists under our paradigm, under status quo, go out of their way and say that you can't choose for yourself, we are making the better choice, right? We don't think that happens in a country like India where feminists are fighting multiple battles. But what does happen under their paradigm is that feminists now are confused about what they are even fighting for. Are we really fighting for the freedom of women? Are we really fighting to liberate women in the first place? Because what are we doing? We are legitimizing the choice that these women make. Like, we don't think the legitimacy, it doesn't exist under our side, but we tell you the actions or the familial relationships that exist between the man and the woman and the rest of his family and the societal pressure that exists, right? That is what is being legitimized under their paradigm, and that is what we have such a huge problem with under opening opposition, right? We tell you the abuse has to be called out at any cost, right? There can be no dilution of principle on the part of the feminist movement. We tell you the feminists who are already a part of our movement are also going to see this as a betrayal of the initial principle of equality, which is what the POI at the start was, right? We tell you because they haven't dealt with these ideas about how feminism reduces the threshold for these women to be able to break out of the social conditioning and help their children break out of the social conditioning, we are very, very proud to oppose.
Right, thank you, DLO. To start the lower house and invite the member of government.
Hello, am I audible? Alright. Madam Speaker, we think the opening halves of this debate have been incredibly myopic in terms of analysing what the ethics of care actually imply in terms of looking at macro and micro level decisions that affect the rest of society and how they are made by entities like the state and by entities like individuals who have immense decision-making power, right? We think that that kind of analysis is something that needs to come to you from the closing half, and we will provide that to you. Most of opening opposition's case is that women should learn to become more rational, more cold and stronger, and all of their problems will fix themselves. We tell you that in a lot of cases women don't have the power to do this, but what will help them is if states learn to be more emotional, to care about their families, and then use that as a calculus to make their decisions to help these very women, right? But here's our extension. We believe that in absence of the ethics of care, when decisions are made at the macro level by states and so on, but also at the micro level in interpersonal relations, has made this world an unfriendly place to women, and especially an unfriendly place to people anywhere who are feminized, right? Who are seen as weak and who are dominated by those in power. We tell you that the ethics of care can ensure that these people are finally brought out of the shadows, are finally not made invisible, and their problems are considered seriously, right? The reason that I asked Arjun that POI about what he envisions a decision-making process that does not have the ethics of care involved in it, right, was because I know that it's about statistics and it's about more cold, rational things that you can quantify and measure. But in a lot of these situations, right, when you make high-impact decisions solely on the basis of cold, calculated reason and logic, you often don't see what the effects of these things are on the weakest sections of society that overwhelmingly tend to be women in a lot of countries around the world, right? Decisions like whether to make war or not, or whether to introduce neoliberal free trade agreements or not, and how they will affect women workers who, in a large number of cases, are the cheapest workers for people to hire. I'll give you several examples of how this works, but first let's give you the principle. The duty of the feminist movement is to act as the voice of the feminized and the voice of the women who are silenced everywhere by powerful actors and by powerful states, right? In a world dominated by inherently cold and rational calculuses like neoliberalism in international economics, realism in IR, or economic indicators in terms of development economics, we tell you nobody really cares about what happens to the little actors, the women on the margins of society, and how their families, family dynamics play out, right? Nobody ever looks at how our decisions on the macro level affect these people. Which is why after the Vietnam War happened, right, nobody ever cared about all of the women who had to take care of their husbands who had post-traumatic stress disorder following the war in Vietnam, right? The government never paid attention to what would happen over there. All they looked at was, okay, the war with America is over and that's all we care about, which is why even from the US, no effort has been made to help these women. We think that that's problematic. We think that feminists need to change this by lobbying their representatives, by pushing the UN and other international organizations to incorporate the ethics of care in how they make their decisions, and by refusing to support especially female candidates who don't espouse an ethics of care. But how has this panned out in the real world before that opening?
So, how do you think this change is going to happen when the feminist movement doesn't have enough social capital to implement the change, the first starting goal that they set out to change when the movement started out?
We tell you that the feminist movement hasn't really actively tried to get this ethics of care incorporated in state relations up till now. So we don't understand how this idea of like political capital being wasted even exists, considering that this world already sucks for women like less and new stuff, right? So okay, look at like this, right? There are several examples of how an absence of the ethics of care has severely harmed women, especially in macro level decision making. When the USA like made an alliance with like the pre-democratic country of South Korea where generals controlled everything, they created a scenario in which Nike and other companies created factories in South Korea where they made sneakers, right? But what happened here was that women were incredibly easy to employ because they didn't ask for very much. And why was this the case? Because families preferred to educate their boys at the expense of sending their women to work at these factories, right? At really dirt cheap, like low wages without like really good working conditions. And this continued to happen for decades, and Nike continued to get away with this kind of behavior because all that the American government and other governments looked at was, okay, is the GDP of South Korea growing? Like, is trade relations improving? And those sorts of things. Nobody really cared about what would happen to the women until feminists stepped in, talked to these women about the kind of emotional pressures that their families put on them, and then made that a central idea in getting them to collectivize and form labor movements, which is what eventually led to a large burgeoning women's labor movement that played a crucial role in bringing democracy to South Korea. We think that nobody has an incentive to care about women when all you see is dollars, right? So we think that's problematic. But furthermore, we tell you that in Afghanistan, for instance, the US government decided that in terms of pure, cold, calculated reason, right, we should ally with all of the warlords because that is the best way to achieve stability, which is something that can be quantified and seen in terms of like headlines, right? But they never noticed like what the custom of pederasty, for instance, does to little boys who are feminized by all of these Afghan warlords who kidnap them and then rape them over and over, right? The US government has no incentive to care about these people, and that is why its soldiers and its bases stationed in Afghanistan routinely ignore these complaints when locals make them, because all they care about is achieving this macro peace or stability, right? Furthermore, we tell you that troops stationed in different countries around the world, US troops in particular, often have like prostitution rings that like open up around these bases. But again, the US government does not care as long as in terms of realist like international relations, I set up my bases here and there. And even in Saudi, right, nobody cared about the large numbers of women that got raped and the families that were destroyed by the military intervention, right, by NATO. We tell you that these sorts of things need to be looked at in closer and paid closer attention to, which is where the feminist movement steps in. By emphasizing the ethics of care, by telling governments and by telling people that you need to look at the smaller actors who are predominantly women, right? You need to look at how families get broken apart and how women have to deal with the wreckage afterwards, right? How like they have to go about making sure that their children don't end up joining militias, for instance, in Africa, and how they don't become radicalized by jihadists in Pakistan. We tell you that governments will only start taking these things seriously when the feminist movement comes together and actively espouses the ethics of care, in contrast to a scenario in which feminists believe that like overall just making sure that women become more rational and able to fight one-on-one against their oppressors changes, right? We think that other actors like the state have a far greater power to change these societal dynamics that are made out of constructions of male or female or masculine and feminine. We think that that construct, in order to be broken, needs more feminist international relations scholars, more feminist economists to come out and affect these decision-making policy levels by specifically emphasizing the ethics of care as an inherently feminine value that is good for women and that is good for all of society. We believe that in order to end warmongering, that in order to make sure that families are destroyed by wanton decisions made by governments that simply do not look at the people in the shadows, this move is necessary. The feminist movement is uniquely placed to do this because we stand for the women and we stand for the marginalized and the oppressed, who are like usually feminized, right? So we tell you that in order to ensure that feminists are doing all that they can to make sure that macro level decisions across the world keep women in mind, keep the silenced in mind, and keep the children in mind, we're proud to propose.
Thank you, Member of Government. Member of Opposition, please.
Am I audible? Yeah? Madam Speaker, we have three extensions at closing opposition. We're first going to directly clash with closing government and tell you why a narrative that tells you that you need to care about women when you're making decisions outside of like the limited context of the opening house battered women debate means that you're coming from a superior position, which means that you are forcing onto women the idea that you can decide for them how their interests should be prioritized and taking away from the fact that women deserve rights because they are human beings. The secondarily going to talk to you about how the narrative of interdependence means that that women make emotional decisions in very stressful situations that are not insulated from the ways those emotions like sort of influence the way those emotional decisions are necessarily legitimate. And we're third going to talk to you about how this creates a barrier to actualizing the free choice of women in these contexts. Right? But first, Abhiraj tells you that the ethics of care has to be looked at in a broader perspective than what the opening half told you, as a result of which when you make decisions like neoliberalism or you opening up your economy, you need to take a female perspective into account and try to understand that a woman may be impacted in a certain way and decide for that woman, right? We think this is fundamentally antithetical to what the feminist movement currently stands for, right? Because we think the way care works, so the way you currently view having to prioritize female interests is you view it in the lens of saying that women really don't know what's right for them and that we have to subjectively determine what is good for them, right? We think this is a problem simply because you deny women the agency to determine for themselves what is right for them and what is wrong for them, right? We think what you need to be pushing towards is removal of the subjectivity, right? Because we think care, the way you prioritize female interests is inherently subjective, right? We think what happens in Abhilaksh's model is that the feminist IR scholars and feminist economists who try to prioritize female interests come from a position where they are deciding for women in general what their interests should be and how those interests should be prioritized, right? We think at closing opposition we stand by a principle where women have the ability to determine for themselves the way that those interests are prioritized. Because we think in status quo, in the absence of a narrative that tells you that you need to care for women and therefore like prioritize the fact that they are someone's mother and someone's wife before when you're making decisions, means that the care takes within its fold this position of superiority of the person who's making that decision, right? We think the way the feminists currently push for pro-feminist legislation in terms of saying that they want to assert for themselves the way women should be making those decisions and not be beholden to a decision made by an external factor is something that we stand for at closing opposition, right? But let's deal with our second extension, the idea that opening government seems to talk about, which is that we need to respect a woman's choice and we need to respect the ability of a battered woman to make a legitimate choice, right? We stand by that. We think a woman who legitimately chooses to stay within a marriage where her husband beats her should be respected, and we think that's a choice that should be respected. We think the problem with the narrative that the feminist movement pushes if they endorse the ethics of care is that you can in any situation make that emotional decision, right? We disagree with that. We think there are certain situations where the context in which you are means that there are so many oppressive ways that you are, or your emotions are manipulated, that you don't have the ability to make an emotional decision that you would otherwise make outside of that system, right? Which means that we think that women should be able to leave those situations and then decide for themselves on emotional grounds, should they choose to do so, to go back into that marriage, right? We think when you're insulated from the pressures of the patriarchy or the familial structure that tell you that the interdependence between you and your husband mean that you can never leave your husband, you're incapable of making the kinds of emotional decisions that you would otherwise make. What does this mean? We think that in a context where, for example, a woman is required to, we think what this results in is like the protection of children in these abusive relationships, right? We think, for example, that in the current paradigm where women are within like these oppressive structures and then try to make emotional decisions, they don't take the most vulnerable actors into account. And we think these vulnerable actors are A, themselves, and B, their children, right? We think that children simply do not factor into that decision-making matrix because the dominant narrative tells you that the reason behind you having to stay in that marriage is your husband, and that your husband requires you and without you cannot survive in that patriarchal society, right? We think what you need is a situation or an environment that allows for this woman to determine where those emotional decisions really lie, right? We think you need a situation where the woman can determine for herself who the most vulnerable actors are and where that emotional decision really should be. Which means that while opening government says that we need to respect the choice of a woman and respect her ability to make an emotional decision, we agree. But we think the context in which that woman is making that emotional decision in opening government means that it is not the right kind of emotional decision. We think you need to be able to you need to respect
respect the ability for them to make it in a more nuanced fashion. But let's thirdly deal with the idea that that it becomes more difficult for women to actualize this choice, right? Because where does the feminist movement really lie, and who are the people it's talking to? We think the feminist movement in general isn't capable of dealing with a person who views himself as a rational third party, or largely men, or anyone who holds a position of power in society, who think that they are rational third parties from the context of these women in general, right? We think the feminist movement doesn't really talk to the person who thinks that he's objective and has the ability to make a more objective and therefore a better decision than a woman who's making a decision on emotional grounds, right? Which means that what we're talking about here is that, well, when the harms that our opening talked about in terms of either interdependence or gender roles, placing the idea that women are inherently inferior exists. We think that the idea is that women should be making these decisions on their own. What we think the problem is that when this happens, the ability for this third party to say that he is making a better decision in terms of enforcing or pushing onto himself or onto the woman the idea that there is a better rational decision, which is for you to not go back to that marriage, simply becomes that much more obvious, right? Because the feminist movement is now pushing the narrative that the way a woman will make a decision once she leaves go.
The feminist movement has been trying to reform gender roles and patriarchy for decades, and we're still a very long way away from that. Why is it less important to emancipate 11 million women from domestic abuse by allowing them to report?
Madam Speaker, we obviously don't stand by the ability of women to report. We think it's more likely that when they leave these situations for once and then have the ability to make rational decisions or even emotional decisions should they choose to do so, they'll be able to report better. We don't see where opening government is going with that argument, right? But we think what happens here is that we just create more barriers on the ability for women to actually actualize those emotional choices, right? Because what happens when they've left and they want to when they've left and then they want to go back to that, we think what happens is that people tell them that they shouldn't be making that emotional decision, and the idea that women are generally more likely to make a decision on emotional grounds and not really weigh out the pros and cons of state becomes more solidified, right? Which means that the people who would otherwise support the decision in status quo, which is that when a woman has exercised her choice when she chose to stay, are now going to say that every woman's decision is a decision that is made on emotional grounds and therefore delegitimize that choice for much more, right? You think you're creating barriers to actualizing the ability for women to make any choices we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you, member of opposition. Let's call upon the government whip.
Madam Speaker, the opening half of this debate might have made this debate particularly about how to help victimized women, etc. We are expanding the scope of this debate by talking about how this particular move will change the moral culture that we live in, to move from one of hard calculation to one where we treat humans as humans, to one where we understand that there's an intrinsic value for you being oppressed, for you being the weaker section of society. But we understand that this has to play an important part of our moral calculus. And we believe that this is something that we should consider. Some direct rebuttals to closing opposition, right? First of all, closing opposition's entire argumentation is predated on the fact that we are somehow coercing women to make a particular choice with respect to ethics of care. What Abhilash wanted to argue to you in this particular scenario is that we want to understand the situations that you're put in that force you to make these particular choices, and we want to make sure that the circumstances that you exist in that force these choices do not exist in the future or do not exist for future generations, right? And in this particular scenario, we believe that we are taking away the decision-making power of women. We are in fact emboldening it. We are making sure that this decision-making process is much better and incorporates something that women actually do care about, which is the ethics of care. So, moving on to what we believe is a significant part of the debate, right? First of all, opening opposition wanted to argue to you this entire idea that somehow gender roles can be deconstructed and that society can move on in a scenario where gender roles are something that we shouldn't consider. We believe that that's a very improbabilistic stance to take upon yourself, because we believe that to a large extent what we see with respect to gender roles is that they're incredibly pervasive, is that a lot of times women's cognition of these things are significantly affected by how they are in society, which means that it's difficult for them to argue that somehow by cold and hard calculuses we will somehow do away significantly with gender roles. We don't believe that that's the situation. But what we do believe is important is that you need to start viewing the idea of these gender constructed ideals significantly differently, right? Because to the extent that currently in status quo we always view these the gender construct as something as male, as let's say cold and hard and calculating is something significantly associated with males, and something as the ethics of care that is associated with women in specific. We believe that we are willing to play up the ethics of care as something that should be the bastion for women to campaign for, right? And we believe that to the extent that we are able to do this, we believe that women are in a stronger position to argue and understand the circumstances in which other weaker women exist, right? We believe that to a large extent we need to blur the lines between how these gender constructs are co-opted by, let's say, men or women, which means to say that we aren't arguing that if feminists say that ethics of care should be prioritized, that they should only be prioritized for women, which is what Abhilash wanted to talk to you about in his speech, right? This debate also becomes about how we prioritize the weak, and especially since to a large extent how patriarchy constructs this is that anybody who is feminine in nature, or anybody who isn't able to defend himself, or anybody who doesn't have the strength or doesn't have the logic to go beyond to do well for himself, we believe that becomes significantly important, because that becomes the moral calculus that you take when you start thinking about who to care about and when to make these decisions, right? We believe that this becomes particularly important, right? But we also believe that it's more practical to argue that we won't work to destroy women's broader conception of self, right? We believe it's important to understand that to a large extent the gender construct also play into women's larger conception of self, right? And we believe that we are willing to push forward for this, right? How does this essentially work, right? We believe that to the extent that even if, like, as we take the opening house characterization, even if a woman decides to engage in an abusive relationship, we believe that to the extent that this move will work and to the extent that she sees validation of the ethics of care from feminists around her, we believe that it changes the power calculus around how she engages in the relationship, right? And we believe that to this extent that even when men see that the ethics of care are something that should be prioritized, we believe that they can't simply put off ethics of care as something that is significantly weak or something that is associated with women, right? And we believe that to this extent, women will not be wholly relegated and their idea related to care will not be de-legitimized, right? We believe that to this extent, we don't ignore women in this particular situation. We in fact give them the ability to understand situations and become stronger. I'll take opening, yeah.
Several women are already unaware that the conditions they are subject to tantamount to abuse. How does your paradigm, one that's largely derivative of gender-specific idea of emotions, correct this?
Alright, so first of all, we believe that we don't see any analysis from their side either as to how women will understand that what they're facing is an abusive relationship, right? What Abhilash wanted to talk to you about in this situation is that there are some metrics with which a woman can understand that she exists in an abusive relationship, right? What Abhilash wanted to argue to you is that it's important for the ethics of care to take into account the circumstances that she exists in. And we believe that this debate also becomes about what sort of morality is pursued beyond that, right? And we believe that that's an important part of this debate. But this debate is also about how, this debate is also, as Abhilak spoke to you about, how we make decisions on the macro level, right? And how we treat the idea of weakness and the idea of the weakest section of society. Because how it exists currently in society is that we try to prioritize or maximize the minimum position by using economic measures, etc., right? But we don't understand the significant social and parochial hurdles that might be preventing the weakest section of the society from coming up, right? When we start prioritizing understanding the situation, understanding the idea that the calculus that you exist in might be significantly blurred and grey, we start making better policies of understanding these situations, right? Because we believe that the policies that Abhilash wanted to talk to you about, the realist policies, etc., are largely predated on the idea that that to be powerful, you need to be cold, hard, and calculating. You need to exist in a free market framework where we don't necessarily understand why you couldn't rise up to that particular situation, but the fact that we have given you the means, you didn't use them, and which is why you're problematic, right? How does this affect how we view international relations in this particular scenario, right? We believe, as Abhilak spoke to you, and there is another example of this, is essentially Korea and the destruction that they faced at the hands of the Japanese, right? We believe that a lot of the grievances that the Koreans faced was significantly different from how they ended up tackling them, right? They ended up tackling them by introducing free market economics and all those things, trying to better the lives of these people economically. What they didn't tackle was the exceptional emotional and mental trauma that a lot of these Korean comfort women face, right? And we believe that to the extent that the ethics of care says that we should start prioritizing these things, that we should start making this the basis of our moral calculus, we are proud to propose.
Because this debate is how to guide the opposition way. Hello. May I begin? Madam Speaker, from side closing opposition, we brought you 3 extensions. The first, in direct response to closing government, is that the feminist narrative necessarily fails when you define that the protection of women's rights should arise out of your emotions towards them or their dependence on you. The second is when the immediate reaction to an oppressive situation is based on emotions, it will never factor in all of the relevant stakeholders that the woman should consider, which includes the woman and perhaps even a child in the kind of battered relationship that they were talking about in the opening half. But finally, we tell you that this move from government only exacerbates the notion that women require external intervention in order to secure their rights, because they are never capable of making decisions that aren't based on emotion and actually calculate what is best for them. So coming to our first argument in response to closing government, we believe that the feminist stance should be that the protection of women's rights arise out of women being human beings, period, rather than because of the relations or feelings that people might feel towards them. Because there's always an inherent subjectivity in the way that people feel like this feeling of protection towards women should be carried out or should be protected by the law or by policy, right? Because we think presently, in fact, it is this ethics of care narrative that individuals exploit to oppress women behind the facade of protecting them. So if I say that a woman should always wear modest clothing because she will be in danger outside, because men are always preying on them and that's why I just want to protect her, you are in fact working within a paradigm of people caring for women or trying to protect them in the subjective perspective of what they think protection of women's rights amounts to, right? So when you are in fact propagating this notion that everyone has a responsibility to protect women, all you are legitimizing is that everyone should care about women. But you lose the ability to define how they should care about women, right? And we tell you that this subjectivity is what is harmful. So we think that the feminist movement should stick to making concrete policy demands about what they think are right for women, rather than asking people to care about women, because that has historically always done more harm than good. But coming to our second extension, right? We tell you why interdependence within a patriarchal construct is almost always characterized in terms of the duties of a woman towards very specific stakeholders, right? It's never about interdependence towards who is in fact one of the most vulnerable actors in this situation, who will often be the child of that woman, right? We tell you that when it's characterized in such a manner that a woman does have duties or should feel emotional towards her husband or towards protecting the dignity of her family, it's always a situation where whenever she's in this oppressive situation and has to immediately take a call based on emotion or based on the interdependence between her and her family, these patriarchal constructs of who exactly she does have an emotional or dutiful responsibility towards will always affect or will always play a role in influencing her decision. All we have told you is that it is legitimate for women to make emotional choices or make decisions based on their relations with other people when it is free and fair and when they are in an environment that they can actually legitimately experience those emotions and evaluate those relationships. We've told you that when you immediately respond to an oppressive situation through emotion, you are going to be influenced by all of these patriarchal constructs that necessarily do take place within that household where you have been oppressed or you have been abused, right? So we simply tell you that your immediate reaction should always be to insulate yourself from that patriarchal environment. Because we think that then you are more likely to be able to rationally assess the situation, more likely to actually take account of other stakeholders, right? Because in order for the patriarchy to be dismantled, it is essential for those who are oppressed to, at some point, critically analyze the structures that are oppressing them. We tell you that is impossible when you are within that environment or when you continue to be within that household, because you simply always have those emotional responsibilities towards your husband or towards your family honor that will be playing on your decision or how you feel emotions, right? So, coming to our final extension, we agree with side-opening government that this narrative of ethics of care is going to be bought into predominantly by women who are being oppressed. But we don't think that this is going to change the perspective of the third-party neutral observer who can objectively view a man abusing his wife and see it as an absolute wrong. We tell you that this encourages the notion that women do need external assistance to be saved from themselves, because the feminist movement is simply overplaying the likelihood of women making decisions based on emotion. And we tell you this doesn't change the perspective of everybody else who can't view the emotions of that woman, who can't view the complex narrative that might have influenced her to make a decision a certain way, and will always think that someone being verbally, physically, mentally abused is a necessary wrong. This only perpetuates the notion that someone from the outside needs to come in and rescue this woman from herself, right? But before moving on, I'll take one from closer.
Okay. Hillary supported the war in Iraq because she had to portray herself as an unfeeling masculine figure in order to gain traction with her other peers, right? And in order to get elected. Why is this a good society for us?
We're not sure. So we do think that care is a great thing, but we don't see how it necessarily benefits the feminist movement. Because when the feminist movement espouses this ethics of care, it necessarily becomes viewed in the perspective, like I've already said, of protecting women. We don't think that is the same as Hillary's decisions based on care or emotion being legitimized, because that is simply saying that decisions based on care should be okay in all situations. We think the message you send out when the feminist movement specifically emphasizes the ethics of care is that women are more likely to take decisions based on emotion rather than what is objectively good for them. We tell you that perpetuates the notion that people need to externally intervene to help out these women, and we think that's necessarily a bad thing. Side-opening government told you that this is tantamount to victim blaming and it's morally bankrupt because you can't take away the right of a woman to make this choice. We tell you victim blaming is really different, right? Because it's when you say that an individual has brought suffering upon herself because of all of her actions. It would be if a person were to say that because of her insolence, she invited this abuse upon herself. What we are talking about is something fundamentally different. Because we are talking about what the necessary immediate reaction to an oppressive situation should be, and which one of those reactions would be one that is in the best interest of the women. We don't think that encouraging women to critically analyze rather than immediately react with emotive responses is necessarily a bad thing, right? Because it only encourages them to insulate themselves from the kind of surroundings and environment and those patriarchal constructs and messages that have continuously been fed to them that completely remove the ability for them to actually make a free determination of who they care about. We think it's hypocritical from side government for them to talk about responsibility and ignore the most vulnerable actors who these women might in fact have a responsibility towards and who often aren't factored into this decision-making matrix. We're very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Opposition Whip, and thank all the speakers as well. Please cross floors and shake hands.
Interdependence. And the best adjudicator at NALSAR 2016 from MSR Law, Vignesh. Now we're going to invite Vasu to announce the result of the novice final.
We also want, there's no award for this, but we also want to acknowledge that the best internal ad is a joy. And Shweta.
So in the novice final, with NUAS A as opening government, SMC B as opening opposition, VIT L at closing government, and VIT K at closing opposition, the runner-up was closing opposition, VIT K. Is that here? Yeah? And the winner of the novice finals for NALSAR IB 2016, opening opposition, SMCP. Are they here?
They had a flight.
Ah, cool. Thank you.
We are ready with the result of the open finals. So everyone please take a seat. Before we make that announcement and hear from Professor Mustafa, I just want to say two things. First, so on behalf of the adjudication court, and since I've been part of the NALSAR IB for 5 years, on behalf of the organizing committee, a big thank you to the NALSAR administration. I've interacted with the NALSAR administration for 5 years as a student, And by far, I think I've heard no the least number of times with Professor Mustafa. It's almost always a yes. He's always the most accommodating, and we thank him from our side. Secondly, I also want to acknowledge that the organizing committee this year were composed of largely, actually almost all of them, were second-year students who were doing this for the very first time with no guidance whatsoever from any of the seniors. So we want to acknowledge that they did a fantastic job in running a tournament that was largely on time and very, very professionally run. And with that, I hand over the mic to Professor Mustafa. I actually call upon Jasmine to announce the result.
So we had an amazing debate in the grand finals, and in the end, the champion of NALSAR IV 2016 is the closing government. We also like to acknowledge that the runner-up of the finals is the opening opposition. I acknowledge the finals best speaker, the member of the government, Abhiraj. Congratulations to all the teams. Please get your trophy, if you want it.
Wait, we come.
I also call upon all the finalists to please collect your prize money from Urvi, your prize money and your certificates from Urvi. Please also speak to Urvi for any prize money that has not yet been distributed. Brings us to the end of the closing ceremony, guys. Thank you all for a wonderful tournament. And see you all next year.